Welcome to Redundancy Matters with me, June Hogan. This is the podcast where I help HR professionals and leaders managing redundancies to put people at the heart of the process. And if you've not tuned in before, it's really great to have you here, and thanks for listening. I'm a qualified career coach. I'm also an outplacement specialist, and I've got a background in HR. And I've been working with individuals and organisations navigating redundancy since 2019. So today, I'm talking about some of the practical things that you can do during a redundancy process that sit outside of the formal consultation meetings. These are practical ideas that I hope will help ensure that people feel heard and supported throughout the process. Now, I know from my own experience what it can feel like to feel isolated during a redundancy process and how much of those kind of seemingly small things would have had a big impact on me, not only during the process itself, but also afterwards when I began the work of rebuilding my confidence and really trying to figure out what I was going to do next. So these things that I'm sharing are from my own experience on both sides of the redundancy table, from the years of supporting clients with outplacement support and reflecting on their feedback on processes that landed well and maybe those that didn't land so well. So I think sometimes we might underestimate how much the small things really matter when you're planning a redundancy process. Or maybe you're focusing on the legal aspects. And perhaps there's pressure from the leadership team to get all of this completed as soon as possible, as there's a focus on cost and a focus on the timeline and all the planning. But there are lots of things that you might not see on a spreadsheet or see on a plan that really make a difference. Things like the line manager who checks in outside of those formal meetings, who's available, who really understands and wants to speak to those members of their team who are at risk and offer them support and guidance where they can. Then there's the HR manager who might take a few minutes of their time to explain how recruiters shortlist CVs, for example, because there'll be lots of people at risk of redundancy who haven't had to look for a role in some time. Some people have never had to look for a job. And I certainly see that when I work with individuals in outplacement support who have had very long careers in some cases, and in some cases very what you would call successful careers up to senior manager, director and beyond. And they've never had to look for a job. So that opportunity to just sit down and spend some time with people, again, can make a big difference. Also, there's the willingness to listen to what's going on for someone outside of those consultation meetings, or perhaps someone who makes a warm introduction to their network and offers insights on feedback and potential career direction for somebody. Really making sure that individuals know that they matter, even though they're going through a redundancy consultation process, because at that time nothing is final, no decisions have been made, and they're still an employee and a member of the team. It could be the LinkedIn recommendation or the support or comment on someone's open to work post, for example, or just the conversations around rebuilding confidence and recognising that redundancy doesn't affect everyone equally, and so some may need more specific support than others. And those are just a few of the things that really matter to people that I know from my own experience and also experience supporting clients. Because those are often the things that people remember years later, and they're things that people share with me where they felt like they were really treated like an individual and not just like a number on a spreadsheet in a process. One of the things I also notice is that there's often a misconception that communication can only happen during formal consultation meetings. Because unfortunately, when communication disappears or slows down, then people will fill in the gaps themselves, and they'll usually do that with worst-case scenario situations. So depending on the timeline for consultation, there might not be much to say for a while after the announcement. But I'd recommend not leaving that void for people to fill in the gaps themselves. So my recommendation would be to communicate even when you have nothing to say, which might sound a bit weird, but reinforcing messages that might not have landed completely the first time and letting people know that this is still on your radar. Things are happening in the background, and encouraging line managers to stay visible and accessible at all times. Now, for some line managers, this could be their first time leading a process. They might not feel confident about having informal meetings, but people don't necessarily expect their managers to have all the answers. What they're looking for is their presence and their support, and not the avoidance that I've sometimes heard clients share with me that can happen after an announcement, because they want someone to know that they haven't disappeared just because the situation might feel a bit awkward. And some managers can get this wrong because they become frightened of saying the wrong thing, so then they say very little at all. But even if the line managers aren't sure, then they can say so, and they can arrange to get answers or set up a meeting with a member of the HR team. But being visible and supportive is what really matters. It's not about knowing everything, and it's also not about making things up either. Now, in terms of support, most people don't need that kind of forced positivity at these times, the kind of, oh, you've got this, you'll be fine messaging, which comes from a place of good intentions, but doesn't actually help anyone in that moment. Because honesty and empathy are way more important than that. And I recorded a separate podcast on the power of empathy in redundancy situations, and I'll put a link to that in the show notes, because there's a huge difference between sympathy and empathy. So some line managers, and indeed, we're all sort of guilty of this, I guess, and empathy is harder than sympathy. But sympathy can be things like, oh, well, at least you got some money. At least you got a good payout. I'm sure you'll land on your feet, and everything happens for a reason. Now, these are unintentional because they're not, that they don't come from a place of well-meaning. But what they do serve to do is kind of push away what someone might be feeling and try to get the conversation to move on. So if you've ever been on the other end of one of those statements, you'll sort of think, oh, okay, well, maybe you're right. Yeah, I have got some money. So that's, I'll just stop talking about that now, shall I? Or everything happens for a reason. Yeah, okay. Yeah. Well, you might think that, but maybe I don't. So it's about moving the conversation forward from that individual's perspective rather than encouraging the individual to open up and to talk more about what might be going on. So that sympathy can kind of create the distance. Whereas empathy is more about things like, I can appreciate this is a difficult time for you. There's a lot of uncertainty, and I guess that's very hard. Or things like, you don't need to have everything figured out right now. So those are sort of sometimes reflective statements, but they just allow the individual to know that you're happy for them to continue talking about what's on their mind. And also using silence is hugely important as well, to give the individual some time just to reflect and to think about what they might want to say next. And one thing that I've learned from coaching people through redundancy is that everyone is carrying often a lot more than we might all realise. So I've worked with people who are worried about their finances, people who on the surface of it you might not think might be worried about their finances. I've worked with people who are worried about their age, people who are wondering if their skills are still relevant, some who haven't interviewed in 15 years or more or ever, some who are trying to hold everything together for their children while pretending that they're coping, and others who are having to provide care and take on additional responsibilities for their children, their relatives, and people within their community. And so that's a lot to deal with when you've got redundancy on top of all of that as well. So it's about being able to support people to look for the signs, to have those open conversations, and to importantly signpost where there might be extra support or specialist support that might be needed. And again, I'll put a link in the show notes to a free download that I've got that gives some guidance on signposting. And we'll come on to talk about financial signposting in a minute as well, because I think that's something that's really important to help to support people through the process as well. So there might be some people for whom redundancy is a relief. So I certainly have worked with individuals in that situation. So for some people who were planning to leave anyway, perhaps, but just didn't know how to or had the courage to, it could be that they are excited and looking forward to leaving. Maybe financially, this is the best thing for them. So those people are going to need support too in how to manage their reactions and their emotions in front of others for whom this is devastating. And so I think they can still be empathetic, towards colleagues, but they might need some support from yourselves or from line managers on how they do that in the best way. And what does that empathetic approach really look like for people? So as well as these things, I think there's some real value in asking what support would actually help them. So asking those at risk what support they need, and then gathering topics for group sessions. So you can use the employee reps for this if you're in collective consultation, or you can do it in individual meetings if you're not. And what this does is it really helps to give people a sense of some control when the process can feel out of control and overwhelming. You're asking them what would they want and helping them to make some decisions and have some agency and advocacy over these things. Because the support that you're going to offer, and you may have already lined up some support, you may already have an outplacement provider in place, for example, it's only supportive if it feels relevant. So if you are using an outplacement provider, then I'd encourage you to ask them if they can tailor their support. Or if you're doing things internally, then really making sure you're providing what people actually need, not what you think they might need. So, for example, I recently worked with a client who had asked for a workshop and they wanted to include a section on presentation skills as part of a recruitment process. This is something that came up during collective consultation, and so I was able to adapt and tailor the workshop to suit. I've also had requests in the past for specific support in specialist areas such as the design and creative space, and I've been able to arrange that for people. So if you're doing this internally, you could set up something simple like informal lunch and learn sessions, and you can use the internal talent team if you have a talent team, or working with the HR team yourselves. And this is an opportunity to bring some really great value to people, because we often forget what feels obvious to us is completely unfamiliar to someone who hasn't had to look for a job in a while. People don't really know how recruitment works, and there's lots of noise online about some things which are completely untrue and other things which are just made up for kind of clickbait on social media. So people don't know how applicant tracking systems work. People don't understand how AI fits into a recruitment process. They don't really get that recruitment might be very different to how it was when they were previously looking for a role. There's the kind of one-page CV advice conflicting with the two-page CV advice. And maybe when they last applied for a role, it wasn't about tailoring your applications and CVs. You just kind of had one and you sent it off to lots of people. So when people don't understand something, then particularly when there's a lot of ghosting within the recruitment process at the moment, there's a lot of people putting time and effort into applications and then hearing nothing, then they can assume that it's a kind of a personal thing. Maybe they're not good enough. Maybe, that's it and I'll never find another job. So I think bringing some reality to how the recruitment process works is a really useful thing that the HR team can do for people, just to prepare them and to bring them up to date with best practice, etc. And I think it's also great to be realistic about this with people from the start, so they're not building up false hope about what that landscape might look like. Now, practical support is super helpful. And so some of those things that I've just described really focus on things that are practical. And bringing in an outplacement provider, they can do this. That's their specialism. That's what they do. Or you can ask to have individual support if that's more appropriate, or if you're only running a small reorganization. But it's about helping people to build their confidence at what can be a difficult time with a lot of uncertainty. Another area I think organisations sometimes underestimate is the financial fear that redundancy creates. So I work with, what on the surface of it are highly capable, senior or financially stable employees. They can still experience huge anxiety when the uncertainty about their regular income appears. And often people won't openly admit that they're worried about these sorts of things because there can be a huge amount of shame attached to redundancy. So they'll talk about things like updating their CV or applying for jobs. But underneath all of that, there might be a panic about mortgage payments, childcare costs, their pensions, or maybe even just how long their savings are realistically going to last them. So practical financial well-being support can make a huge difference, not just kind of a general well-being message, but it's the practical guidance. And I'll put a link in the show notes to a really great session that I had with money expert Abby Birch, who's got some super useful and practical tips on how to signpost and support people at risk. without treading over those boundaries, because this isn't about you as a HR professional or as a line manager digging into someone's finances and offering them personal advice and information. It's about having the opportunity to signpost them to those people who can. But you could include sessions from a specialist around budgeting, bringing your pension provider, for example, explaining how redundancy pay and tax implications work, and then signposting to debt, mortgage advice support, or simply just helping people understand what financial resources and potential benefits that could be available to them. Because when people are emotionally overwhelmed, then that kind of financial uncertainty just really increases. And of course, there's the emotional impact of redundancy, which I talk about a lot on the podcast. And I've coached senior leaders who suddenly feel completely lost after redundancy because work was a huge part of their identity, a huge part of their life. And that emotional side of redundancy is something that organizations might unintentionally overlook because they're really focused on the process. But redundancy for anyone, no matter how senior you are, is emotional, even when people expect it, because it's still attached to way more than an income. It's still attached to identity and self-esteem and how people show up in the world and their place in the world and their sense of purpose. And even when maybe they dislike their job or they got a good package, those emotions can still come out. Maybe not straight away, but they will come out. Because there's the grief, the loss of routine, and sometimes even the shame of redundancy, no matter how it's come about. So there's a lot of unpacking there to do. And I think that's one of the benefits of career coaching as part of outplacement support. And so when redundancy can feel like it's out of control for people, then regaining a sense of control is something that's in your gift that you can do during the consultation process. So often decisions are happening behind closed doors. Maybe timelines might feel a bit uncertain. People might be having incomplete information because decisions haven't been finally made. And so this can all compound the feelings of confidence and powerlessness. So think if you can actively look for ways to help people regain that sense of control. And that might mean maybe allowing flexibility for interviews, so everyone's entitled to reasonable time off if they're at risk of redundancy. So being flexible as much as you can about that. It might mean encouraging managers to protect some time during the week to support people with looking at their CVs, or helping them to have access to the technology to sign up for job updates and to do recruitment research, etc. It might mean offering different types of support for different groups of people so that they can feel that they're being treated according to their particular needs. And simply giving people choices as well and asking them that question, what do you need right now? Because depending on how long the consultation process is, depends on how long you've got to offer people support. And that support might change at times during the consultation, because that choice really matters. And even those small moments of autonomy can really help to restore some confidence and give people that sense of dignity as well. I've talked a lot about line managers throughout all of this because they do have to carry very much of the process. Yes, as a HR team, we're there to support people, but they will be seeing members of their team go, and that can be really hard. And some of them can be delivering messages that they fundamentally disagree with. Some of them are quietly terrified of upsetting people because it's a difficult message. Maybe they've not had to do it before. And some will just emotionally detach because they don't know how to handle difficult conversations. And others become a bit kind of overly optimistic because they really can't tolerate sort of sitting with that discomfort and that uncomfortableness. So managers need coaching through this too, and real guidance to communicate like a person, not like a robot, not like someone reading a script. And I'll put a link in the show notes to a couple of episodes that can help in terms of preparing line managers for redundancy consultation meetings. Because as I said before, people don't expect perfection from their managers during this situation, but they do notice when they're absent. They do notice when they're avoiding them. Then they do notice when they're not showing up. So it's important to maintain that connection and not just to move into sort of cold procedural mode because line managers are afraid of saying the wrong thing. So building in this coaching up front, checking in with them during the process and making time for them along the way, just to check in on how they're doing as well, is an important part of supporting people through the process. And of course, I talk a lot about this on the podcast. It's important to remember that how an organisation handles redundancy really shapes the trust during the process, but also after the process ends. Because the people who remain are still watching. The future candidates who will be joining your organisation will hear those stories. It's a very small world. And beyond that kind of reputation and employer brand that is important, it's just about humanity and being a human and doing the right thing for people. Because most people understand that businesses will need to restructure. But what most people struggle to forgive is that feeling of feeling discarded during that process. And so sometimes the support someone receives during redundancy becomes the thing that helps them rebuild faster. And whilst you won't be able to remove the pain of redundancy entirely because it's a necessary business decision, you can change how someone feels about it while they're going through it. And that's what I hope that this podcast helps people to do, to support people through redundancy with kindness, with compassion, and with dignity. And so I hope that the episode's been helpful today. And really thank you so much for listening, and hope you'll tune in again soon. Thank you so much for listening to the Redundancy Matters podcast. I hope you found today's episode helpful. It would mean a lot to me if you would follow, rate and review this podcast wherever you listen to your podcasts, as this helps it reach more people who are managing redundancies. Let me know what you thought, and if you have ideas for future episodes, I'd love to hear from you. You can find me on LinkedIn, June Hogan, and get in touch via my website, wildwoodcoaching.co.uk, where you'll also find more resources to help you manage redundancies. I hope you'll join me again soon for the next episode of Redundancy Matters.